Hello everyone, or no one. Today we're going to go through Redux Toolkit, which is a great state management package which basically abstracts all the complexities of passing down props and global state and all this nonsense. You could think of it as an alternative to something like useContext, the React hook, but you can use both of them hand in hand or separately. It works really well with TypeScript once you get past the little weirdness, like how you actually type things like the store, which we will go through in a bit. And all your state will be perfectly type safe. So let's jump straight into it. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new Next.js app, which we're going to use to do our Redux Toolkit testing. So I'm going to run npx create-next app at latest, and I'm going to call this Redux app, TypeScript yes, and I'm just going to quickly go through all of this. And once that's done, we're going to install Redux Toolkit as well as React Redux. And then we will open this up in VS Code. And I've realized that they use npm to install when you first use create next app, so I'm going to delete the package lock and I'm going to reinstall just to be safe, just in case there's any conflicts between the two things. And it seems to be okay. So let's get started. Now for Redux to work, we'll have to wrap all the components that we want to be able to access this so-called store, which you can think of as an internal database, in with a provider. So usually I'll just wrap the entire app, so I'll put it in the layout. But since we're using Next.js 13, this is a server component, and I don't want to convert our global layout into a client like so. So instead, I'm going to create a client wrapper. So the first thing I'll do is create a components folder and just call this layouts and client wrapper. So this one we will be using use client. So I can write that up top here. And we'll wrap everything. So this will take in children. So let's just quickly create some props. So children, React node, and pass in the props. And I'm going to go a little bit quick here because I'll assume you know the basics of TypeScript and React. If not, I have a quick crash course on that, which I will put somewhere around here. You can click and check if you're not too familiar with React and TypeScript. So the first thing we need to do is wrap everything in a provider, which we then wrap all the children, which will be the entire app. And this takes in a store. And we haven't created this yet, so let's move on to creating our store. And you can put this wherever you want. I like to put this in either a DB folder or a React Redux specific folder called Redux. But for this example, I'm going to put it in a DB. So we'll need a store, and we'll also need something called slices. So I'm just going to create a dummy one for now called UserSlice. Now before we actually jump into the code, I want to pull up this image which kind of shows you the flow of how everything works with Redux Toolkit. So the first step is that our React component will issue an action through this thing called useDispatch. You can think of an action as just simply a JavaScript object that has some sort of payload of data that's associated with it, and we then send it forward to our reducers. At this point, the state hasn't actually been mutated. They are just sort of the action has been sent forward. The next thing is the reducers. These are responses to our action that was just called, and they then perform the change on our immutable state. Because a state in Redux is technically immutable, under the hood, you don't have to worry too much about the technicalities, but this then handles all the complexities of messing up state for you. And the next step is then the slices within the Redux store. The slice basically contains all the reducer's logic and actions for every single feature. So you can think of this as like the brains of the reducer. This is where the state is actually being mutated and affecting our store. So then the React component will be reading from our selector, which is basically where the internal database is, and it subscribes to all the changes that come through from our store. So long story short, React components say that you click a button to increment a number, the usual example. Click the button, the action click button has been sent to our reducer. The reducer then goes into the slices and looks at all the particular knowledge. For example, the increment will just add 1. Internal store is updated, so then the state is updated. Our selector will then be listening to the changes. It sees, okay, state has increased by 1, tell the component, and then our component will re-render. So with the theory aside, let's jump into actually coding. So we're going to start with the slice, and then we're going to work on the store. So inside the slice, we have something called initial state, which I'm sure you can guess what this is. And in my case, I'm going to have some sort of user state type, which I haven't created yet. And the initial state will have an ID of nothing, a name of nothing, and email of nothing. And by nothing, I mean empty string, of course. All of these will be strings. So let's just quickly create the types. So I'm going to create a types folder here. Call this user. Let's make that user. So export type user ID string, name string, email string. And we'll import this type in here, and all our errors have disappeared. So the next thing is to create the actual slice itself. So export const user slice, and we have to import something called create slice from Redux.js Toolkit. And within here, we pass in the initial state, as well as the name of what this slice is actually going to be. So the name of the user, because we want our slice to be called user. We pass in the initial state, which we created up here. We could have also just manually done it in here, but I feel like it's cleaner, and you can also type it a little bit easier rather than doing it as user. And in here, we'll have the methods. So we could have a set user method, which just you pass in all this within the payload, and it sets the actual user in our store. I'm also going to create a clear user, which doesn't take any sort of payload, it just resets the user. So you can see here, there's two parameters. The first is the state, and the second is the action. So the action contains the payload, which is all the actual data that we're passing in to mutate the state. And the state is, well, you guessed it, the state in our database. So in here, we don't have any action, we're just simply clearing. We don't actually need the payload. So all we do is just take the state and reset everything back to the initial state. And we also have to export these actions. So a slice has actions on it. So these two are considered the actions, as well as exporting this as a reducer. So now that this has all been set up, we can go back to our store and start working on this. So even though we only have one slice right now, and technically one reducer, I'm going to use a method called combined reducers. So combined reducers, and I'm going to pass in the reducer, which I'll have to import slices slash user slice. And I can pass it in here with a name and then pass in the reducer. And this is, of course, imported from Redux.js Toolkit. So if I was to have a whole bunch of other reducers, say items or whatever, I could just pass it in here and so on. But for right now, we only have the one user reducer. I just like to set this up ahead of time so I don't have to change things around and refactor everything later. And then we will create a method called setupStore, which takes in the preloaded state. And this is wrong. So we return configure store, which is also from Redux Toolkit. And this takes in the reducer, which is the one above here, as well as the preloaded state. Now this is actually incorrect, but I do need a type before I can continue. So this is probably the most important type of Redux Toolkit. Every time you want to access the state on your components, you'll have to pass in this root state so it knows how to type everything properly. And in here, I'm going to say preloaded state, which is imported from Redux Toolkit, and pass in this root state. There's another type called app store that you might see on quite a few repos. We don't really need it that often, but I'm just gonna put it here for completion's sake. And most importantly, we have the store itself. So this We'll take in the reducers once again. And if you really want to be complete, you can do this. I rarely use Redux state and App Store types. The biggest one by far is root state that you'll need on every single one of your components. So if we have a look at this, we basically pass in all our different slices. We do some magic that you don't really have to care about and create the types that we'll be using within our components, and then export this store. And finally, within the client wrapper, we can then import this store from our DB, and all our errors are gone. So now we go back to the global layout and pass it in here, client wrapper. And now everything within our app should be able to access our Redux store and mutate it. So now within our page component, let's just clear all of this nonsense. Create a simple UI that's just going to display the name, email, and all our state. So to access all of this stuff, we use something called useSelector. So then we get our user out of useSelector, and then we pass in that magic root state that I kept talking about, and access the state.user. And within here, we'll be able to get things like the name, the email, and I think it was ID. And you can see if I mouse over this, it's properly typed, so it has the user type. So if I try to get anything else from this, like phone number, it's going to say phone number does not exist on type user, which is perfect. And if I didn't pass in the root state, it's going to say state is of type unknown, because it doesn't know what this is. So this is why I kept harping on about the root state. It's very, very, very important. So this is how we access things. We just use useSelector. We could, of course, just get the state itself and get the user out of it if you prefer doing it that way. But I prefer to destructure it straight from the user. If I had another one, I could say, for example, I had an auth that had a token within it, I would just do this. So I'd have a whole bunch of useSelectors that separate which things are coming out of them. Just a bit easier to read in my opinion. And if I wanted to change the state, let's say update user, and we're just going to hard code this. So the name is going to be Nick, email is going to be nick@gmail.com, and the ID is going to be 1. There is one other hook we have to use, which is the use dispatch. So I'm going to create that up here. And down here, we can use that to then set the user. And then we pass in all the parameters. So whenever it might look like we can just call set user because there's no type errors. If we do this, nothing will actually happen. We have to wrap this with dispatch to make sure it actually goes forward to it actually gets dispatched rather than call the function and nothing happens. So this is a mutating our state, and it should update all of these things. So down here, let's say name, email, ID. I'll just do that, very simple for now. And we're going to create a couple of buttons down here. The first one will set the user, and the second one will clear the user. And we can create a function like we have here, or we could even just do an anonymous arrow function down here, which takes in dispatch, clear user. And we, of course, import both of these from the UserSlice itself. So let's run our app with yarn dev and ignore the styling because it's going to be very ugly. And actually, before we go into the page, I just wanted to add use client at the top here because we are using hooks. So since we're using these hooks, we have to add use client, otherwise it's going to throw an error. So here we have our very blank app. So I have the two buttons, set user, clear user. And if I set it, you can see here's my name, here's my email, and here's my ID. And clearing user sets it back to the empty string. So all the actions are working, the state is being set, the listener is listening, and everything's good. I just wanted to add, if you wanted to properly payload your actions here, which you should, in my opinion, you can pass in something called payload action, and then the user. So this could be anything. So say I put number here, it's going to say ID does not exist on type number. For example, increment count, I would do this as a state and action with a payload action of number. And within here, just passing the payload itself, because it's not an object, so I don't have to do payload dot something. So the payload itself will be a number. And you can see that here, payload is a number. I could make this a string, I could make this anything you want, but this is how you properly type things within your actions. And I didn't catch this earlier, but now that I've properly typed things, you can see that this was supposed to be a string. Type number is not assignable to string. So since I properly typed it now, the error is coming, which is great. If I change this to a string, then all my errors are gone. And that would have potentially caused an issue if I was working with a backend that expected a string and I sent a number. So this is why we properly type things, and this is why TypeScript is great. So I hope my very brief intro to Redux Toolkit has helped you out, and I would use this along with something like Firebase auth, store the user in Redux, and then use that throughout the app to check whether the user's logged in or logged out or who they are and all this great stuff. I know one of you, Jack McKimbo, you reached out and said, can I do a tutorial on Firebase authentication next? So I'll be using this Redux along with Firebase. See you in the next one.